The topic tonight is Theomorphic Man and the Nature of God. Situation: Holy Cross University in Worcester, Mass. Audience about 600. Present, Truman Madsen to speak on the Mormon understanding of God. Also present 3 well-trained Jesuit priests. In the aftermath discussion, I asked the question, which any child could ask a parent: why did God create mankind? About 3 main lines of answer were presented. Number 1, he did so for his own goodwill and pleasure. And don't ask beyond that. Second, he did so for his own glory. And related to that, third, he did so in order that he might have creatures to worship him. Now, when you've said those 3 things, you have about summarized the whole history of Western theology, because those are the lines that have traditionally been affirmed. The tendency in all of these traditions is to say, don't press too far. We don't fully understand the why. At the end of the discussion, one of the present critics said, "Let me tell you the ultimate reason why we cannot accept what you have said here tonight." And I had talked about the nature of God as expressed fully in Jesus Christ. I had said that Jesus Christ is the complete revelation of the ultimate nature of God, and that if we know him and understand him, we understand the ultimate nature of the divine. And they said, no, because you make him human, all too human. And then one of them said, and worse still, you have the audacity to say that man can become like God. And then he held up his hand in a special way and said, blasphemy. Why would God create man as his everlasting inferior, when God, having all power and all goodness, according to the creeds, could have done otherwise? Why did he create man everlastingly his inferior? And the answer was, in the context of the discussion, because God's very nature forbids that he should have peers. And I replied, interesting. Our understanding is that God's very nature requires that he should have peers. And then asked the rhetorical question, which God is more worthy of our love? Now go with me to the Kirtland Temple in the mid-1830s, when a young man named Lorenzo Snow, having lived most of his life within a few miles of Kirtland, comes into a meeting where the father of the prophet Joseph Smith is giving patriarchal blessings. As he listened to him give blessings to persons he knew, but he knew Joseph Smith Sr. did not know, he was impressed that he seemed to say things which he could not have known unless under some sort of inspiration. The meeting ends, and the prophet's father approaches him, takes him by the hand, and says, after introductions, "You will become one of us." Something Lorenzo Snow could not at that time even understand. "And you will become great even as great as God is, and you could not wish to become greater. Now, the first promise he understood and didn't believe. The second statement went over his head. But he remembered it, and years later, in the home of Henry G. Sherwood in Nauvoo, Illinois, they were discussing one of the parables of Jesus, and in that setting, it came to him, he said, as a revelation, as clear as anything he ever received in his life from on high, what that meant. And he formed what he saw, or felt, or understood, in a couplet which we often quote and sometimes misquote. One version of it, which I prefer to use tonight, is, as man now is, God was. As the Son of God is, man may become. Now, to him, as he later said, that was a marvelous revelation, so much so that he kept it sacred and did not talk about it at all, except once to his sister Eliza, and then once again when he was abroad in the mission field with then Elder Brigham Young. It wasn't until he heard on April 6, 1844, the prophet Joseph Smith deliver what we now call the King Follett Sermon, in which he specifically says that it is the proper destiny of man to become like the Father and the Son, that he then dared to voice what he had earlier in his own soul known. Perhaps nothing in the Mormon tradition has occasioned greater opposition, more discussion, and perhaps more misunderstanding than that couplet. At the very end of his life, in fact, on the day he became president of the church, then in his mid-80s, he testified to the 12 of this experience, and then said about it two remarkable things. One, that it had been all his life since the guiding star. But second, that because of what he understood on that occasion, he had been cleansed, and he believed all of the children of God could be, of every impure ambition or aspiration. By the way, I'm told that he once was on campus here when there was only a small campus down near what we call Academy Square. Looked through a window which was also a mirror. On the other side, the children whom he was observing saw themselves reflected, but he could see through without their awareness of his seeing. What were they doing? Well, apparently a class where the teacher had put clay into the hands of the children. And as they were working with the clay, some were forming round balls and then marking, in a fairly crude way, continents. So they were making clay earths. Now, I don't know how old these children were, but as he stood and watched them, he was moved to tears and turned to whoever was with him and said, "These little children, unaware, are playing at something they may in the eternities eventually do. They are creating worlds." Well, the analogy he used in teaching this was that of the children of an emperor. They are born. They are embryonic. They are mere children. They themselves unaware of what it means to be born of such a person. But as they grow and mature, it becomes clear that they are heirs of the throne, that they will become the very inheritors, not only of the realm or the kingdom, but of the very nature of their parents, the king and the queen, the father and the mother. Now again, that seems elementary, but it comes as a blasphemous shock in the classical Christian and Jewish tradition. I once raised the question with a descendant of Lorenzo Snow. if he had ever taught this in his home to his family. And the answer was yes. And when was that, I asked, persisting? Well, Lorenzo Snow became president of the Salt Lake Temple before he became president of the church. And he sometimes returned from his service in the temple, and we gathered together in the home night mode. But sometimes he came home from the temple after meetings with the brethren, woke us up from our sleep, and shared with us in the spirit of testimony what he had learned and what he knew. What we have just been saying is implicit and explicit in the book all Jews and Christians accept, namely the Bible. Well, the verse that he rediscovered, Lorenzo Snow, is in 1 John. Beloved, it says, now are we the sons of God. And it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he, meaning Christ, appears, we shall see him as he is. And every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself, even as he is pure. That's a specific verse of the Bible, New Testament verse, that says we are to become like Christ. There it is. But he never understood it so until after his experience in Kirtland and Nauvoo. I've been in correspondence for over 5 years with a man who's still at work on a book which will ultimately, though kindly written, be an attempt to undercut this very doctrine. He is a minister and has lived among Latter-day Saints for more than a 20-year period. He has great regard for our people, but he believes this is the primal heresy that is motivating Latter-day Saints, and it must be struck down in the name of the Bible. For Christmas last year, I sent him an 18-page letter in which I took most of the occurrences of what I call the I am statements in the New Testament, where Christ says, I am something, and then matched them with other statements in the New Testament which say, you are. I'll just give you a few examples. You know all these, but to remind you, the setting, the place, and the time of what he said adds greater weight to the statement. One example, I am the light of the world. When did he say that? During the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, during the high holiday when there were huge 75-foot poles with cisterns filled with olive oil and huge wicks, and those lit up at night, not just the temple complex area, but the entire city of Jerusalem. In that context, he says, I am the light of the world. But everyone knows, he also said, ye are the light of the world. Let your light so shine. He says to the woman at the well, I am the living water, water that will spring up to everlasting life. But he also says, he that believeth in me, as the Scriptures hath said, out of him shall flow rivers of living water. He says, I am the salt of the earth. But everyone knows, he also said, ye are the salt of the earth. And if the salt has lost its savor, it is henceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out. In passing, I observe that salt does make everything taste better if you use just the right amount. So it affects everything with its savor. Something else about salt. If you pour it into a wound, an open wound, it stings, but it heals. And the salt of the earth, I suggest to you, has both functions. It makes every human contact better. Latter-day Saints who truly live their religion are indeed the life the savor of interpersonal relations, but in addition, we sting like the dickens. He said, I am the living bread. That's the name of the city you sing about, Bethlehem, Beit Lehem, house of bread. But he also said of us, be my shepherds and feed my lambs and feed my sheep. He said on another occasion that he was the firstborn of the Father. Now, surely that's a superlative claim that cannot be extended to anyone else. There's only one first. But he also says in the Revelation that if we receive him and are born of him, it will be as if we are the firstborn, for we will belong to the church of the firstborn. Therefore, all that the Father hath shall be given unto us. I could go on, but the New Testament itself is a mine of comparing his greatness and his ministry with the possibilities in his children. And he does not qualify. The end of the Sermon on the Mount, which no one really believes, maybe even Latter-day Saints don't, is, I would that you should become perfect. I'll give you the 3rd Nephi version. I would that you should be perfect, even as I, or your Father in heaven, are perfect. And I suggest that the word perfect is not an appropriate word in its fullest significance until he had been in fact resurrected and glorified. But he clearly is admonishing the multitude of men, women, and children, just as I am resurrected and glorified and perfected, so you may be. What is the commandment then? Become as I am. Now that's breathtaking to the world at large, and perhaps a sacred thing we should not bandy about. We often say that Latter-day Saints are distinguished from others in the religious world by teaching the anthropomorphic character of God. The other side of that coin is we teach that man is theomorphic. In other words, he has divine possibilities. Let me now speak of another avenue of conviction that contravenes many of the philosophical alternatives. You have not used, probably in your own daily vocabulary, the following 2 philosophical terms, but they have dominated philosophical thought for about 50 years. One is the phrase logical positivism, and the other is existentialism. A logical positivist is so convinced that science is the primary method for discovering truth and for predicting and controlling environment, that he maintains that there are only 2 kinds of meaningful propositions. So mathematical statements and formal logical statements can be taken to be true. They are spoken of as analytic propositions, which do not bear directly on questions of sense experience. But the other category is sense experience, which they hold is primary and even the exclusive source of our knowledge. And they hold that unless you can relate a statement to sense observable or laboratory kinds of conditions, the statement is meaningless. It's meaningless in the sense that it is not subject to confirmation and therefore can be written off as a pseudo proposition. Now, complexities arise when you start talking about remote possibilities of observation. A parable about this. Suppose I am a gardener and you are my friend, and we go and look at a beautiful bed of flowers, and I say, you know, while we're asleep at night, a gardener comes and weeds the garden, cares for the flowers, and even helps them bloom. I reply, I don't believe in your gardener. Let's come some night and check it out. So we come and watch all night and no one comes. And then the person says, but I didn't explain to you, the gardener is invisible, so you can't see him. And I'm about to write him off, but then being generous, I say, well, let's set up an experiment. We will observe the flowers day and night, and we will take measurements. So we make the observations, time passes, but not one change that occurs in the flowers is not explicable in terms of cause and effect that we can observe. So I'm about to say, you see, there is no invisible God. And he said, wait a minute, I didn't explain something to you. The effects on the flowers are invisible. Now, at that point, how are we going to set up any way to find invisible effects from an invisible gardener? That parable, in a way, challenges the whole Christian tradition with the question, if you want to say that God is invisible and you want to say that the soul is invisible, how will we ever talk meaningfully about them? And the standard reply to that has been, well, we don't use sense experience in these matters. We're talking matters of faith, and we're talking matters of conceptualization. And as a matter of fact, with St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian hyphen philosopher, took every instance in the biblical record, Old and New Testament, of the words behold or see or perceive when related to divine matters and changed those words to conceive. So for Aquinas and most other rationalists, the idea of God is itself a concept in our minds, but there are no percepts behind it. Since God is in nature incorporeal, without body, therefore beyond any perceptual experience, we must talk in other terms, namely concepts. The question of whether God can be seen in any appropriate use of the word seen is raised by C.S. Lewis in a classical essay in which he talks of people who, like my friend Richard Cowan, who is blind, a generation of children are born to people who heretofore had good 20/20 vision, but all of the children born are blind. But they learn all the same words we all learn, including see and perceive and behold, but they use them, obviously, without any backing from sight. I have this experience when I shake hands with Richard Cowan occasionally. We chat briefly, and then he says, "Good to see you, Truman." And I walk away, but he hasn't seen me. Well, imagine such a generation blind using those words, and then imagine that a new generation arises who can't even remember seeing, as did the first generation, and then forget that they have forgotten. Now that's the condition, in a way, of the whole religious world on the question of the seeing of God. The passages in the New Testament that say no man hath seen God at any time are changed in Joseph Smith. In one case, no natural man, no man unquickened by the Spirit has seen God. Elsewhere, no unrighteous man. But when Jesus is in the quandary of trying to convince disciples who are rubbing their eyes in disbelief, and Luke says they believed not for joy. In other words, it was too good to be true. And he says what? Not, check out the arguments for God, and you'll know that I'm still real, but, quote, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have. And so Thomas, who said he wouldn't believe until he did, now stands before him and says, "My Lord and my God." Seeing was for Thomas believing. It was also for the other disciples who did not believe Mary when she came with the report of seeing. So the New Testament says what we want to say, that there is a proper and full-bodied sense in which we can and eventually will see God. And that is because he is in nature seeable and is not in nature utterly invisible. He is presently not seen, but ultimately we will see him again as we saw him before, this time embodied. Now the other movement that undercuts this notion is what I called existentialism. It came in the notion that when you want to talk about real meaning in life and all that has to do with religion, it is totally subjective. So they ignore the posits of science and continually ask, what is the impact? What is faith introspectively? There's a technical name for their kind of introspection. It's called the phenomenological method. It is an effort to close your eyes and ask yourself, what do I feel now? But that isn't deep enough. Feelings, as they understand them, are more or less on the surface. There's something deeper still, something even below the levels we call conscious and subconscious. And you ask yourself then the question, is there something in me that can describe or at least help me come to grips with my faith in God or in Christ? Usually these writers have been negative on the logic of belief, if there is any, and have held that pure rationalism gets us nowhere. So they have been very unimpressed with the classical arguments for God. Kierkegaard, for one, loves paradox and insists that to come to Christ, you begin on what he calls an aesthetic level. This is the early part of your life when you are impressed with surfaces and sights and sounds and tastes and smells, but then you grow and you get into the ethical stage where you begin to have rules or principles for conduct, but then you soon enough discover that you're not living up to those principles, and you enter an area of despair. And that for him is when you become truly religious. As he puts it, you are crucified upon the paradox of the absurd. You leap in total blind faith and say, I affirm that Christ is somehow related to me. But no propositions can be derived from that experience, and no one else can be brought to it by you. You are in a kind of dark and despairing solitude, but you have committed unto the death to Christ. What then is your relationship? Your relation is in a faith state when you encounter the mystery. And when you encounter the mystery, you come away knowing two things you did not know before. One, that you have had the encounter with the mystery, and two, that the mystery is mysterious. And that's it. So now I deal for a few moments with the contradiction that is imposed upon us in either direction. Imagine saying that the unconditioned God becomes conditioned, namely a man in space and time. Imagine saying that the utterly unchanging, yet changed through a process from infancy to maturity to final death. Imagine the paradox of saying that on the one hand, God is the utter and ultimate cause of everything created, and then saying, but he himself became a creature without changing. And on and on. The image of God is engraven, we are told, in our countenances. That's in a Mormon sacred text. Genesis itself speaks of Adam as a generic name, not just the name of the person Adam, but a generic name for both Adam and Eve. He, or they, the gods, called their name Adam. And Adam, male and female, were in the image of God. This is our unique reading, but if you talk to someone who knows Hebrew, he will say, well, that's the way it is in the Hebrew, but you can't say that. Anthropomorphism, the term for the belief that God is somehow man-like, is rejected by all three of the monotheistic religions. They constantly say, yes, the words are there, these words are used, but don't take them literally. Obviously, they're not intended literally. God does not have a hand, even though it says so. God does not have a voice, even though it says he spoke. God is not properly a he, even though that pronoun is used. I remember a conversation with two brilliant rabbinical students. The discussion had to do with the phrase in Exodus about Moses. Moses, it says, saw the burning bush, yes, but it also says he talked with God face to face. Panim v'panim. Well, I got discussing this in the original Hebrew with these two boys, and they eventually were at each other's throats. One of them went with the phrase and said, you have to say, that's what it says, face to face. No, it doesn't mean that. It means something, but it doesn't mean that. The reason he saw God in a burning bush is that God could not manifest himself with a face. All of the Book of Mormon prophets who claim to have seen God, and there are 12 of them by my count, are speaking usually in terms of his face. The New Testament promises that if you will come to Christ fully, you will eventually have the Father manifested unto you, that they all, Father, may be as I am, that they may be one as we are, that they may have that glory with me that I had with thee before the foundation of the world. That's the famous high priestly prayer of John 17. And finally, everywhere you look in the Doctrine and Covenants for manifestations of the divine, you will find a description of countenance. His eyes were as a flame of fire. The hair of his head was white, like the pure snow. His countenance shone above the brightness of the sun, and his voice was as the voice of the rushing of great waters, even the voice of Jehovah, saying. And for that set of verses, we have a parallel in the Revelation of John. Well, do we then, as Latter-day Saints, take anthropomorphism too far? Answer, we take it as far as Christ took it. Philip, he that hath seen me hath seen the Father. Have I been so long with you and you did not recognize me? Others take that to be a metaphysical mystery, but our understanding is he is saying precisely, if you come to know me, my nature, and even my face, you will have come to know the personage who is my Father, and we are so much alike that if we manifested ourselves to you at the same moment, you would have a hard time distinguishing who is the Father and who is the Son. I've been moved by an account of Heber C. Kimball I may have mentioned, when he is taught by the prophet Joseph that he, Joseph, had had a vision of the eventual destiny of the 12 through their travels, their troubles, their trials. Says Joseph, I saw you introduced in the very presence of God. I saw that you all looked alike. Now, one way to read that is that they took upon themselves what we might call family likeness. You look like your father. It's a family resemblance. Another way to read it is that whatever their individual differences, the personality, and everyone is different. Even identical twins are different. Another way to read it, I say, is that they were all filled with the same glory. No man, said the prophet later, can describe it to you, speaking of the glories of the resurrection. The old man glories in bloom and beauty. Yes, that is likeness. That is fulfillment. That is theomorphic man. Another of the images which was used by Jesus at the climax of his life deserves a little more attention before we sum up. In the very setting of the Last Supper, in the very setting where there has been an announcement of betrayal, in the very setting where Jesus has disrobed except for a towel, and then in a menial demonstration of his role as servant of all, washes the feet of his disciples and then says, as I have done unto you, so do you to each other. And in the setting, finally, of some discussion among the disciples about who would be greatest, there had been prior such discussions, and in each case Jesus had typically resorted to children as the example. Whosoever becomes like this child will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. That was a puzzlement to them. But now, the question comes up anew, and he shows them. Doesn't just tell them, shows them his role as servant. In that context, he introduces a strange simile, a whole chapter of John devoted to it. Namely, I am the vine, ye are the branches. Goes on to say in various ways, you cannot have life except you are in me as the vine. If you break the branch off, it withers and dies. You cannot bring forth fruit in the kingdom of God without me. Without me, in fact, he says, ye can do nothing. That's strong language. Nothing? Surely we can do something for the cause without being, as it were, grafted in to him. No? In the ultimate work of the kingdom, the transformation of men, you must work with and through his power, or you are powerless. Now, I introduced at this point the famous currant bush story, which I always think of when I'm in the Holy Land. It's the story of Hugh B. Brown taking his pruning shears and a currant bush which has grown as high as the garage, but no fruit. It's gone, as they say, all to wood. So whack, whack, whack. He cuts it right down with only a few inches left against the ground. He had a poetic temperament, and as he looked down, and the sap oozed out of those cut branches, it was as if he could hear the vine or the currant bush weeping, saying, I was making great growth. You have cut me down. How could you do this to me? And he replied, listen here, currant bush. I'm the gardener here. I have cut you down in order that you would bring forth fruit. Someday you will thank me for this. Years later, he was about to be promoted in the Canadian Army to the status of general. He was the next man in line, and then he received word that the man between him and that calling was killed in battle. So he polished his brass, prepared himself, was summoned, in fact, to headquarters, walked in with a smart salute, and awaited the announcement. Brown, said his superior, you think you're going to be general, but you're not going to get it. I called you in to tell you that. Carry on. Then the man left the room, and President Brown looked at his desk, saw his file open, and written in huge red letters across the file, this man is a Mormon. Got on the train, went back to bivouac, got more bitter with every click of the rails, knelt down in his tent and shook his fist almost, saying, God, how could you do this to me? I was making great growth. I was entitled to it, and you have cut me down. And then he heard his own voice from the past say, look here, currant bush, I'm the gardener here. I've cut you down that you might bring forth fruits. Someday you will thank me for this. Well, his subsequent career you know about. The Lord blessed him, and he did indeed bring forth fruit for the master. But he was in the vine, and no illusions remained in his life that he independently could become great. That is the saving grace in the Mormon understanding of becoming like Christ. You can only become like him through him. You cannot aspire to anything higher than he aspired to, which was, Father, not my will, but thine be done. As Christ broke his own heart in submitting to the will of his Father, but ultimately to the glorification of the whole human family, so we may have to break ours in like manner in order to fulfill his will in our lives. I close with one other glimpse given us by our modern prophet that pertains to this theme. He, speaking of the fall of Adam, spoke to the point that in one sense Adam did not sin in partaking of the fruit, nor did Eve, because it had been decreed that they enter the mortal sphere and begin the process with all of its difficulties and terrors and pains in order to fulfill a larger mission. And therefore the commandment, "See thou partake not," should be read with a comma, unless. Do not partake of this fruit, dear Adam or Eve, unless you are willing to take upon yourselves mortality and begin this process. They elected to do so, and that had been foreordained, not pre-caused, but agreed to in prior councils. Out of the very fall of man comes the new and higher leveled opportunity to truly become most like the living God and his Christ. You can look at a little blob, a newborn child, pink and wrinkled, eyes closed, and say for a laugh, only a mother could love a face like that. To me, that's a poignant statement. I thank God that if no one else in the universe can, a mother can. That's beautiful. But we say that because not too impressive, a little scrawny batch of protoplasm there. And yet, if we live long enough, we see that modest beginning flower and grow. Who can say, if we have that experience in the finite, from a premature, almost bird-like infant to a Winston Churchill or a Joseph Smith, or most of all, a Jesus Christ, how can we deny that given eternity, these little acorns can indeed become oaks? God was once like Christ. We ultimately can become like Christ and therefore like the Father. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.